Hi, I'm Joseph and I'm on Literati with News Central. With me on the show today is Nichelle Smith, the coordinating editor of USA Today's investigative team and the leader of several award-winning race and diversity projects, which includes the Changing Face of America, the 1968 Project, and most recently, the 1619 Project. And prior to working with USA Today, she worked at the Smithsonian Institute and also with Black Entertainment Television. Her projects intersect race and history. On Literati, we speak to Nichelle Smith and her contemporaries and people who are involved in the literary space and anyone who brings these authentic stories to our audience. Literati is brought to you by Glow. Nichelle, welcome on the show today.
Thank you.
It's so exciting to have you here with us today. There's so much to talk about. You have an extensive body of work. The work you do is extremely important to us on the continent. Where would you want us to start with? The more recent stuff, or do you want us to go way back?
Wow, that's a hard question. I'm just humbled to be here, actually.
Is this your first time in Nigeria?
It's my first time in Nigeria, my second time in Africa, on the continent.
You've been on the African continent?
Yes, my very first time was being in Angola at the end of July for our 1619 project.
Oh, okay. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the 1619
Okay,
project.
sure.
Okay, but tell us about your work as culture journalist and how you feel that intersects with, you know, the more traditional literature, so to speak. What's the relationship between culture journalism and the literary space?
Culture journalism is a new term for me and something I've been kind of playing with since I've been talking to people at this festival. And I think I would say that it's an attempt to bring a storytelling approach, akin to fiction perhaps, to those news stories that might otherwise be a little bit mundane. I think when you get to being 20 years, 30 years into a particular field, it's easy to have gotten your formula down and gotten a sense of what the audience, might not necessarily be your audience, but what the audience for your vehicle, your newspaper, what they want to hear and how they want it delivered. So being a culture journalist to me is being inside of it a little bit more, catering to a particular audience within that audience that you know is dying for this sort of news, really wanting some sense of connection with them and getting into what that culture is, an understanding of it, absorbing that, and then being able to process that into a story that tells the truth about a particular person, a particular culture, and paints a picture of something that any audience is going to want to know more about.
The two projects that we're going to talk about, the 1968 project, you've just described as culture journalism, is that?
I do believe so, and even extending it a little bit further back into some previous projects that I've done. I'm the editor of our annual Black History Month special edition, which is sort of how the 1619 project came about as an outgrowth of some of that work. I've been doing the Black History section for 8 years, and that in turn came out of a Civil Rights in America project that I was asked to do by our company that looked at all the civil rights stories that we've been able to produce as a news unit with the other 108 newspapers in USA Today's network's chain. And that project, it's been one thing after another, really, since I've started to really focus in on Black history in 2006, I believe it was, when I first began to focus in on that. So that's been an exploration for a features editor who really just thought she would wind up her career talking about shoes and food and fashion and kind of the ordinary and expected ways of things. That was my aspiration for journalism, was to do that. When I got into doing Black history at the request of a couple of reporters in search of an editor, it just took me down a path that has become richer and richer year by year, to where other projects get added, other publications get added, other opportunities get added, that I'm progressing toward some point of continuing to tell our stories in an even more progressively deep way year by year.
Quick question, would you consider yourself a writer? I mean, because I've read your pieces, most recently this Finding Angela piece. I wouldn't consider those reporting as much as I would consider that like a very long...
It was quite long.
a very long, thinking this should be a book, shouldn't it?
It could, and it started for me not necessarily ending up as a book. I just speculated a couple years ago when I began researching for the Black History edition that we produced this year, which I knew had to have some 1619 element in it because it was going to be the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the 20 and odd enslaved people. So I just began researching everything I could with no clear direction on what we were going to do, because I had about a year to figure out what the story angles were going to be. And I just gathered information, came across this name, came across this woman, Angela of Jamestown.
All right, so let's talk about this a bit more. I think we're finally here. So give the viewers a bit more context. What is the 1619 Project?
1619 Project looks at a pivot point for American history. And it's a pivot point that most Americans don't even know is a pivot point. African Americans have been looking at this for a number of years as the anniversary of slavery, which is what, when I began researching, I sort of wanted to unpack that. Like, is this the anniversary of slavery? If so, then I need to know all about it, just to do that one-off story.
Okay.
Well, actually, it is and it isn't the anniversary of slavery. All those early definitions of what Black people were when they arrived are very murky. It took them almost another 100 years to formalize slavery and formalize Black codes through some of the laws.
Wow.
But slavery evolved, and the use of Black people, I believe we're talking about Black bodies in this festival, the use of Black bodies evolved over time as the Jamestown colony, as the English colony evolved over time. So 1619 is a look at that evolution through the lens of African Americans, through the lens of this particular group of people and one family out of the group of people. The initial project that we did for August began as a look at the Tucker family, which is as close to a founding Black family as African Americans get. They trace themselves to two ancestors, Isabel and Anthony, that were on this one ship, the White Lion, that brought the first 20 and odd.
Oh, wow.
So I began looking at Angela as an offshoot of that, and just a completely different story. She didn't come on that ship. She came on a ship a couple days later, and nobody really marked her presence. And it was similar to the way that I think no one really marks Black women's presence even today.
So
let's get into
the story, because it's a very intriguing story, and if you haven't, you have to read the story on USA Today. We have the official record, so to speak, of the first group of Africans that made it across the ocean to Jamestown.
Yes.
And how that evolved, and we have the Tucker family and all of that. But then we have Angela.
Yes.
Who is Angela?
Angela is the mother of us all.
Oh.
She's the mother of us all, is what I said in the article, because I began to think about her solo journey. When the 20 and odd came, I mean, there were other people with them, and they landed nearby in Hampton before being dispersed everywhere.
Where in Africa did they originate? Because we're used to West Africa, narratives of slavery having their origins in West Africa, but that's not the case with Angela.
Yes, very, very different stories. She and the rest of those who were the first originated in Angola, originated in the Ndongo Kingdom, very specifically within the interior of Angola. They were rounded up as a part of a deliberate campaign by the Portuguese to eliminate a kingdom that stood in the way of them progressing into Angola. This kingdom, Ndongo, was the reason that Angola is named Angola, because Angola was the title given to their kings and queens.
Okay.
So we set out to tell, in addition to looking at those ancestors, in addition to looking at Angela, we also ended up telling a very different story about slavery and its origins long before the West African trade became so huge and before it became so much more of an industry and process. This was the Portuguese sort of beginning everything and finding how many people they could enslave, and then going back and looking at slave forts and enlarging things after they found out how much they could do in Angola.
So Angela.
So Angela was a member of this kingdom, got caught up in the roundup of things. And among the myth busting that we do with Angela is the idea that we're busting the myth of Africans running through the bush and having nets thrown over their heads by hostile white people, dragging them off to the coast and putting them on a ship, Kunta Kinte style. It was more sophisticated, more insidious than that. It was getting another tribe, the Mbangala in this case, to do the dirty work for them, eliminating an entire kingdom and culture. And it was looking very specifically at who would be the people who could do the labor. The initial idea with the Portuguese and the Spanish was to let's round up the healthiest and strongest among them to work in the silver mines, to work the sugar plantations, to work in all the properties and within the empire that was growing in Central and South America. That's where Angela should have been going, along with the other folks, the 20 and odd. They should have been going there. Their ship was pirated, and the two pirate ships took this group of people and deposited them in the English colonies. But for that, would slavery even exist? One can only speculate. Certainly the English knew what slavery was.
But it wasn't really their thing.
But it wasn't, yes. Well, they didn't have the manpower or the will or whatever it was, and the Portuguese and Spanish seemed to have a lock on everything, more importantly. So, and they're a fledgling colony in that they'd had Indian attacks and they nearly starved to death because no one knew how to grow food for themselves. They had a difficult time fending for themselves. So they're bouncing back for all that, just trying to figure out how to grow something, how to grow tobacco and make some money. So these Africans arrive at a point where skilled labor is needed. A woman like Angela is in the village. She's at the markets bartering with the goods that she's grown or made. She's taking care of the children. She's growing in the family vegetable garden, taking care of the animals, negotiating back and forth with the Portuguese, or at least being aware of their presence and being able to speak Portuguese, possibly already being Christian. So she had certain skills that would be useful for setting up a plantation economy. So that was at least one of the reasons why she, along with the others, were taken. It was very moving to see her journey, just kind of be there on the ground and experience that. When I thought about her initially, I thought, well, I'll go to Jamestown and maybe I'll put on period dress even, and I'll go and walk where she walked and think about what her life would have been as an enslaved person. And I'm thinking about this secondhand as a many, many, many times descendant of enslaved people, and not knowing where those enslaved people were from and what their specific story was. So I was thinking about it, and I guess perhaps a little bit more superficial way, so a little bit more depth than other stories had taken the Angela story, but still in a very superficial sense. I hadn't really inhabited her world just yet.
Now, this is a particularly intriguing story. There's so many different dimensions of it. And one of the things you mentioned a bit earlier in our discussion is Angela's experience is still very much a modern black woman's the modern woman's experience. How so? Or before we talk about that, how Angela's experience mirrors the experience of most women even now. We'll take a short break, and when we get back, we'll pick up on that.
Hey guys, making music for you is so easy for me to do. But you know what else is super easy to do? Linking your NIN to your Glow line by dialing *109*NIN hash. Or I can call 109 from my Glow line and follow the instructions. And if I don't want to call, I can text my NIN to 109. I can even visit glowworld.com/NIN. And what if you've forgotten your NIN? All you have to do is dial *346# and Glow will help you remember it. Someone may ask, what if I haven't registered? All you have to do is go into the nearest Glow World and we'll help you register. It's that easy. So don't get disconnected from all of the amazing voice and data offers from Glow. Linking your NIN to your Glow lines is simple, safe, and 100% free with zero hassles.
Welcome back to Literati. I'm Joseph Ike, the show that looks at what's happening on the literary space. With me is Nichelle Williams. Right now we're discussing Angela and finding Angela. Before we went on break, we talked about how is Angela's experience still relevant to women today?
Was still relevant. In calling her the mother of us all, I looked at her solo experience in Jamestown and likened it a little bit to my own experiences. And certainly I have it far, far better than she ever could have imagined things. But there's still a point where you get to a position of a certain amount of experience, a certain amount of authority in your particular field. And you look around and there are very few people who are like you within it. So it could be a bit of a lonely experience sometimes, and also an experience that when you look at it, you look, wow, how far I've come with this and how resilient I've had to be through it. So I drew some inspiration, some strength from the fact that this woman survived just getting to the slave fort Masangano, just getting there, being dragged there in chains was survival. Just making it through being branded and baptized and sold and put onto canoes and transported to Luanda and rowed out to slave ships is survival. The Middle Passage, oh my goodness, is survival. Pirate ships intersect. You know you're going on your way to hell, and now you're going to a hell. Like, is this hell? Is this better than hell? What's going to happen?
Next?
Do I dare to even think that somebody's taking me back to where I'm from? I know better, but I want to cling on to that maybe a little bit. So then she gets to Jamestown. A friend of mine was with me when I was with other journalists and just kind of driving through Jamestown and doing a kind of a look-see, getting a lay of the land before I really began to report. And we're walking around on Jamestown Island, and we're by the river, and my friend looks up and says, boy, to be Angela and to be here, even the stars are different.
Yeah.
And that's something, I put it in the story, and I'm just getting little hairs raising just thinking about it, because just to be that alone, you know, whether you were emotionally lonely or not, but just to be that alone in that space and just to be there, to still have survived it, means a lot, I think. I think it just means so much. It says a lot to her mental and physical strength. Now, I'm one of those that pushes back against the notion of the strong black woman as if we're made of stone or something and don't have any feelings and aren't deserving of the same sort of love and softness that other women have. But even with pushing back on that, I have to look at Angela's story and say, well, she survived all of that. So it's difficult for me to believe that she survived all of that, is mentioned in 1625, and then dies. because nobody knows what happened after 1625. She's mentioned. Is she married? Did she have children? Did she run away? Did she have health problems? There's nothing to indicate anything other than she had a name and she was valuable enough to be mentioned by name in that colonial document. She was valuable enough to be named and counted. She counted for something. Ultimately, we don't know her full story, but we know her name and we know that she counted. And I think that's just powerful to hold on to in those moments where you're wondering whether you count.
Yeah. I think it's a beautiful story all around. Another thing this story does is that it's a different narrative from one that we on the African continent are often used to hearing about how the slave trade and what eventually became Africans in the diaspora was mainly centered around Western Africa. This story has its origins in Angola, which is nowhere close to West Africa. Was that a surprise to you as well?
It wasn't a surprise to me on paper.
Yeah.
Because you could begin to look at numbers. What did surprise me is when we started with the very first story we did for the Black History Month section, we started to look at numbers, who was going where and who ended up where. And so what surprised me then is to see that the number, I think it's something like 6 or 7 million, came just from Angola.
6 or 7 million from Angola?
Of the 12.5 million mentioned as being the total that we know of from the transatlantic slave trade, 6.57 million came just from that Central African region. And that's the statistic that blew my mind. I'm like, so it's not Nigeria, it's not Ghana, but it's this place, and no one really talks about it because it was so early on. According to the historians at Boston University that I talked to, for the first 50 years or so, that's the only place where enslaved people were coming from. Now, there might have been 20 picked up here, 30 picked up there around Africa somehow, but that was the primary place they were getting them because the Portuguese wanted to push forth. I had read recently after the story happened that the idea was to push forth from Angola to Mozambique and just claim the whole area. So if you want to constantly move into an interior, and you have a relationship with a tribe that is willing to do the rounding up and the dirty work for you, then let's continue on as far as we can, rounding up all the people we can, enslaving them, sending them to our death factories, our mines and what have you, in Central and South America, and just forge on. And they didn't necessarily have the big ships that we're used to seeing. They had smaller ships, they were cargo ships. So what we learned by talking to Jamestown Museum, Hampton History Museum, is that the model of the ship was much smaller and that black people were packed in, jammed in among the cargo. So we had an augmented reality presentation that kind of gives you this visual and just takes you inside the ship so you can see how small it is and so you can see how very different it is than that West African image. After transatlantic slave trade became an industry itself, that's when you got these big specially fitted ships. But before then, there's tons of, I think there were 36 other ships in the harbor when the San Juan Bautista, the one that the 20 and I and Angela were on, were there. And they're all these small ships. They're not these huge ships, and it's not the same sort of story.
So you're in Lagos now. You spent quite a bit of time in Angola working on this story. And both Lagos and Angola share this Portuguese heritage. Do you see elements of that being here, or would you need to spend some more time here to pick them out? Have you seen any similarities between Lagos, Angola? Like, yeah, I see it.
I'm beginning to, just having been here so briefly in my first time here, but I'm beginning to see how the makeup of the terrain may have worked to the Portuguese advantage. As with Luanda, there is an outlying island, and I think maybe a couple more there that they could use to anchor and then move up the rivers into the inside. And it seems that the makeup physically of Lagos with different islands would have lent itself to the same thing. And it may perhaps be that they experimented in one place and then brought that system to another. So it'll be interesting to see, after the festival wraps up, what more I'm
latest.
able to find.
All right. So now there is the hope we have as Africans with a renewed interest in Pan-Africanism, that it would also be extended to Africans in the diaspora. What are your thoughts on this? The involvement, the sense of home that we would want people in the diaspora to have, the relationship between African Americans and Africans. What are your thoughts on what the direction that's going, or what needs to happen with that?
Well, I think on both sides of it. I think that for African Americans, we've been disconnected for so long and through so many centuries that we have a romanticized notion. When I got to Angola, I didn't necessarily feel at home, and I felt bad because I thought I probably should feel more at home. And getting here yesterday, I'm like, well, not yet, but you know, I am seeing here. I was a little bit excited because I see more people that look like me. I'm like, basically, my whole high school class. They have doubles over here in Africa. So I think it's us getting away from romanticized notions. And I think it's Africans being, from my experience, being a little less judgmental of what we've become, because there was that disconnect, and Africans participated in that disconnect. So if we have become whole new beings who hold some of the stereotypes of our dominant society and who don't necessarily feel at home, I think that we can be forgiven for that in the same way that we can perhaps get to the forgiveness of that knowledge that Africans were complicit, that Africans were participants in the slave trade, something that I'm still dealing with and getting over, actually. I think that we both can realize how much more complex the issue is. It's not a matter of black people sold other black people into slavery. And it's not a matter of, from the African perspective, some things that I've heard, like, you know, well, why can't they get over it and, you know, be better and do better and economically and personally than they have been doing?
And last question, do you see literature as a tool in achieving this?
I think it's been a tool for a while, certainly as we celebrate Toni Morrison this week. We can look to some of her writings as a way of bridging that with certain stories that she's written about the Caribbean. Zora Neale Hurston you can look at in the same way as kind of continuing those folk stories. I think that new generations armed with new knowledge, such as that which the Angela story brings to them, can begin to take that fiction and that literature in different directions to bridge it.
Well, that's all our time will allow us take for today. The conversation continues, #NCLiterati. You have to read this piece on USA Today and look at the other projects. I mean, it's amazing what's out there. Nichelle Smith, thank you so much for being on the show. And we hope we'll have you back soon when this is turned into a book.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you so much.